Okay, so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, and I'm going to be walking you through how I personally set up my Fuji X100V. Now, if you watched my previous video on this, I definitely recommend go checking that out first. You'll get to see kind of a 30,000 foot overview of my thoughts on this camera and why I think that it's super useful as a daily documentation camera. Now, today we're going to dive into a little bit more of the specific settings and a few things that I touched on in that video in more detail. So stick around and let's get into this.
Stop the battle within your soul. You know it's all in your head.
So today I'm going to be having things a little bit different. As you can probably see, I have a secondary camera angle so that you can kind of see what I'm doing with things on the camera, but also something that I'm going to be putting in this is chapter markers, so you can dive into each segment and not have to commit to this whole video, which probably will be a little bit longer than you're probably used to, but hopefully all of the information you need should be in one concise little area. Starting out, I want to talk about how I personally set up my camera with using the control dials versus using all of the fancy fun little dials and switches on the Fuji, which this might sound a little bit counterintuitive to most people that are looking to Fuji because of all of the fancy dials and things on their cameras. For me, as much as I love the experience of using a Fuji to slow down, if I'm going to be using this in a documentation scenario, then I definitely want this camera to be operating just as fast as any of my other cameras. And, you know, the less time I'm spending messing around with settings, which if I'm going out just to like document and create, or not document, if I'm just going out to create art, then obviously using all of these dials and stuff is going to allow me to slow down, be in the moment, take my time, you know, not rush through things. But when I'm using this as like a documentation device, like, you know, we were just on a trip out east and I wanted to take pictures, you know, everything around me, but I didn't want to be futzing around with all the dials and things. I just want this camera to be as fast as humanly possible. So here's how I have that set up. On the top shutter speed dial, you can set your shutter speed like this, or the way I like to use it is setting it to T, which allows all of the shutter speed controls to be done via, actually no, hang on, I have them on the back dial. So I basically control all of my shutter speed using this back dial, which is really great and allows me to be a lot faster. And I think, you know, if you use the dial on the top on the Fuji anyways, you know that you are using the back dial to fine tune that shutter speed anyways. So instead of locking myself into that small space, I really enjoy just leaving it on T, and then I know that all of my shutter speed adjustments are going to be on the back of the camera. Same thing, aperture up front. I have that set all the way over to A, and then that allows me to use this dial on the front to control my aperture, which I really enjoy. Again, speed is the name of the game for me when it comes to documenting daily life. I don't want to be taken out of the moment. I want to be able to get my photos to save for memories for later and be able to get back into, you know, enjoying that time, friends, family, exploring, whatever I'm doing. For ISO, same thing. You can, let's see, I think you can set it to auto. Personally, this is the one thing that I actually still leave in here. And most of the reason for that, I will get into this in the next section, talking about ISO and dynamic range. But part of the reason that I leave this where it is because 90% of what I'm doing, I'm not changing my ISO as much. I think auto ISO has its place, and I think that it can be very useful, but for me personally, that's the one thing where I like to try and stick with one, and that's pretty much it. So jumping into this next section, I want to talk about using base ISOs and the dynamic range tools in Fuji cameras. Now, as much as I love diving into the nerdery of all things camera sensors and color science and all of that stuff, I can admit that I'm not a data scientist. I don't know everything there is to know about these, but what I am starting to understand a little bit more is the way that cameras like the Fuji X100V and Fuji cameras in general use dynamic range in their cameras. Now, Fuji gives you some really cool tools to do stuff that allow you to bypass a lot of the negative drawbacks to shooting on a, Super 35 APS-C size sensor and getting somewhere close to the dynamic range of a full frame camera. Now they do this in their settings, I believe. Let's see. The setting I believe that you want to be paying attention to is dynamic range. Now, you can set this to auto, and also, side note, these settings are pretty much only used in the JPEGs that come out of the camera. So I pretty much from now on shoot RAW plus JPEG. I like having RAW files just for archiving purposes. When I first got into photography, I exclusively shot JPEG just like everyone else, and it's really hard for me going back to see like some of those really old photos and seeing how much they've degraded over time. And I think a lot of that could have been solved just by shooting RAW, starting to shoot RAW a lot earlier. So from an archival standpoint, I love archiving RAW files. I'll be honest, I don't edit them as much, but just knowing that I have that available just gives me a peace of mind to know that these memories can be saved for as long as humanly possible. So this dynamic range you can set to, oops, that's white balance. Dynamic range you can set to 100, 200, or 400. Personally, I use the 400 on it, and what this does is it uses the higher ISO to give you exponentially cleaner shadows. Honestly, it still feels a little bit like magic, whatever they're doing in camera. But I've noticed for me, shooting at the base ISO of 640 using this dynamic range 400, I'm able to get way more dynamic range and way smoother gradations across the images that are coming out of this camera, which if that's not your style, like I definitely, I respect if you're, love that lower dynamic range, kind of more contrasty look, go for it. But for me, I really like being able to maximize the dynamic range that I get out of this camera, and that's how I do it. Interestingly, I noticed that I get a better dynamic range out of the camera without, usually common knowledge would be shoot with the lowest ISO possible. But for this, I find I'm able to get better images using that slightly higher ISO, and then, compensating in other areas, whether that's higher shutter speed, closing down my aperture a little bit, or, however I want to use it. And on that note also, so this is just like an overarching theme that's been in my work lately for both video and photo, is not shooting everything wide open. I think we're starting to see this kind of like renaissance of people going back to more vintage lenses, and those lenses aren't clinically sharp wide open. So, getting comfortable shooting at 5.6, 6.3, oh my gosh, stopping down to f8, but for my Fuji, I've been using it a lot more at somewhere in that 2.8 to f4, 5, 6 range. And it's real, the character that I see out of the images has changed exponentially, and I think that a lot of the, image characteristics from, a camera lens like this, you're not going to start to see a lot of that unless you're stopping down a little bit more. So using slightly higher ISO and this dynamic range tool, for me, has been massive, and I think, again, coming back to how can I use this camera in a way to document daily life, travels, whatever, but then also not have it get in the way of that documentation. Okay, let's talk about film simulations. This is the thing that pretty much everyone comes to Fuji cameras for. I absolutely love them because it means I get to spend less time at my computer and more time out, documenting, shooting, having fun. And also they're just really fun to play with in camera. You can get a lot of really incredible looks with basically no post-production work. And, it gets us back into the joy of shooting. And this has inspired me to start playing around with some of our Canon DSLRs. They have a Canon picture profile editor. And so I've sent these to a few of my friends just to see what they think. And it's kind of cool what you can do with that. I'm probably going to have to do another video on that at a later date, just because I think this idea of shooting for delivery can allow people to really get back into the joy of photography instead of dreading all the time that they're going to have to spend at the computer. So, film simulations for me, I have them set. Let's see. So I believe I have them mapped on this front button right here, which this button has two things that it can do. And you basically can change your custom picture profiles. So I have like an Eterna profile that I use. I really like a lot. This is Fuji X Weekly. They have a massive amount of film recipe profiles. So I think this is one of their Fuji Pro 400H, HP5. I think those are the only three that I pretty much have. But it's kind of great because now I can, at the click of a button, basically have access to the three looks that I'm trying to go for, depending on where I'm shooting, what I'm shooting, that whole thing, which I absolutely love. Okay, so I'm not going to dive into the film simulations and how I have them set up today. There's 100,000 videos of that on the internet, and if that's something you want, drop a comment down below and I will make a video in the future how I personally use the Fuji film simulations. But I absolutely love them for a way to be able to get very quick turnaround work done, or just, again, documentation. While I can make the case that this camera can be used for all things commercial work, this camera for me is all about documenting daily life. And, for me, it really allows me to bring the joy back into photography and video and just creating in general. Like, the whole reason we get into this is because we have a passion for it. And then once that passion gets turned into a job, gets turned into all of these other things, that's where, things start to go a little sideways. So finding ways to be able to bring that passion back into the work we do is crucially important. And, for me, it just so happens this camera is what does that. Okay, so diving in, the next thing we have on this camera is the little Q menu right here. This is where you can put a handful of settings that you commonly will be working with. For me, I like to keep this as simple as possible. I have the ND filter, toggle that on and off, touchscreen mode, flash exposure compensation, and flash function settings. We're going to be diving in how to use this in a studio context very soon. So stay posted for that. For me, the reason that I have these four things on here, the first one is the ND filter. This camera's ND got a massive overhaul and upgrade whenever they allowed you to start using it for video. Factoring in now that I'm primarily shooting with the base ISO of 640, I've actually been really interested in using this ND filter quite a bit more, and I'm actually thinking about potentially trying to use ND filters just in my workflows in general. Part of this has to come with the accuracy of cameras at higher shutter speeds. Now, take this all with a grain of salt. I'm at the very beginning of researching this whole concept, but when it comes to camera shutter speeds, it's really hard for a camera to be super accurate at shutter speeds higher than the scan rate of the sensor. Now, I think a mechanical shutter overcomes most of this, and so, you know, as long as you're shooting mechanical shutter, you're probably fine. But for me, and I can't quite put my finger on exactly what it is, but the images just seem to be better when I shoot them at lower than like a max shutter speed of like 2/50th of a second. So being able to do that using this ND filter and bring down that light quite a bit has been massive. And I've been finding myself using the ND filter in this camera for photography especially quite a bit more. And the images that I get out of it, I feel like just they have like a depth to them that I can't quite explain, but it's there. Touch operation, that one's pretty self-explanatory. I constantly find that when I'm using this camera, the ability to accidentally tap where my focus point is constantly getting bumped. So I like to be, honestly, I leave it off 90% of the time, and that allows me to keep better control over where my focus point is, and not, you know, when I bring it up to my eye, I don't accidentally touch the screen with my nose and, you know, move the focus point all over the place. Or the weird thing for me is I was finding it like would regularly, you know, when I have it slung on my shoulder, simply just the motion of walking would end up moving that focus point around. I imagine most of that was probably just the joystick being hit, but which I also have turned off. Okay, now let's dive into video. This camera is shockingly a really impressive video camera. And I think personally this form factor, if it didn't have the overheating limitations, would be one of my favorite. I love the compact nature of it. The EVF is fantastic. If it only had the like 3.5 mil audio input jack, or, you know, something a little bit more professional in that department, I think this could be a perfect quick clip documentary camera. But all that being said, the basic things that I use for this is making sure that you're dialing in your picture profile settings in camera. The unfortunate reality is this camera only shoots 8-bit video internally, which is fantastic if you're shooting for delivery, but it's really bad if you want to color grade a log footage, which this camera surprisingly has F-Log built in, but I pretty much only recommend using that if you are recording externally with an Atomos recorder, because this camera does do 10-bit video out through the HDMI port, which is great, but also kind of defeats the purpose of this small camera. So that'll be another video for another time, talking about using this as like a full-scale content creation camera. Okay, so the biggest question that I got on my last video about the Fuji was, can you talk about using this camera with strobes? Because that for me was one of the biggest things that I wanted to experiment with this camera. And as it has a leaf shutter, you can do a lot of really cool things, being able to sync the camera up to, I believe it's 1/2000th of a second, compared to the 1/250th or 200 or even 1/125th on older cameras, having to rely on your aperture instead to be able to really control that light. There's only one setting that you have to change on this camera to be able to set it up for perfect usage with an external flash, and that's turning off your live view image simulation. Now, this is going to be in your settings. I have this mapped. So button and dial settings, function button settings. For me, I mapped this one to actually this selector right here, this toggle. So that's going to be on the last page here. And then what you want to do is go down through all the viewfinder settings, and you'll find the preview, exposure, and white balance in manual mode, and attach that to that button. And then from there, what you'll see, let's darken this up so it'll be a little bit more apparent. So right now we have like a really, really dark exposure, but then, and this is the kicker with this, you have to hold this down for like half a second. And what you'll see, let's see. Okay, so there it is with all of your exposure simulation on. You can change settings, hold it down for a second, and it'll turn off white balance. Hold it one more time, and it'll turn everything off. Now, it's hard to see. I mean, obviously that's quite a bit brighter, even though we know if we take a photo, it's going to be basically pitch black. And if I point this over into my office, you can see everything. Like, you can watch how the exposure is constantly changing and shifting. So what that allows you to do when you attach a flash on top of here is that'll turn off all of the exposure stuff so you can see your composition, so you can see your subject, make sure your focus is dialed in, got your focus point lock, all of that. But then when you go to take the photo, it'll automatically switch back to all of your settings that you already have set for your flash images. This makes for really incredible shooting experience overall, and it also allows you to start using the beauty of the leaf shutter in this camera for those higher sync speeds. And also when you throw in the built-in ND filter and all of the other things, this camera starts to become really compelling for on-the-go content creation, or just, you know, making your documentation and portraits that much better. So I really wanted to show off how this is utilized in a real-world scenario. Obviously, our cats needed some new headshots, so I set up this little portrait studio in our basement. Using the Godox Fuji flash trigger, we're able to wirelessly trigger that, and, you know, it works out pretty great. And here's some of those sample images. I hope this was helpful in being able to get your Fuji X100 camera set up for 2023. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. I do my best to get back to as many comments as humanly possible. I am absolutely loving this community that I found in the YouTube space, and I'm excited for all the things that I have planned for the rest of this year and beyond. So can't wait to grow and continue to learn together with you guys, and I will see you in the next video.